Mr. President, as we all know, the most important issues that are facing our country today are the economy, job creation, the national debt, and excessive government spending. One of the things that is having a huge effect on job creation and the economy right now is regulation. The administration continues to overreach and overstep in the implementation of dozens of new regulations, be it the EPA's regulating greenhouse gases or the DOT's recent proposal that would require commercial driver's licenses for farmers who drive tractors. And these oversteps have real consequences in the form of jobs. Take, for instance, Mr. Thomas Clements from Youngsville, Louisiana, who is testifying today in front of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Mr. Clements is a small business owner since 2008. He owns oilfield CNC machining with his wife, and they produce metal parts and systems for offshore oil rigs. His run-in with our overreaching administration started after the tragic 2010 BP oil spill, with the President's decision in May of 2010 to enact a 6-month moratorium on new oil drilling in the Gulf. His business continues to struggle today because of the Department of Interior's decision to slow walk new drilling permits. Before these actions, he had a thriving small business that not only provided for his family, but also for his employees. Today, they're barely staying afloat and will likely close unless the administration changes course and actually begins taking steps toward recovery instead of just continued rhetoric. Another big drag on the economy is the amount of spending and debt. Just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office released their long-term budget outlook. This was certainly sobering reading. They pointed out that under the alternative fiscal scenario in 2024, interest costs, Social Security, and major health spending would exceed all of the revenue coming in to the government. The need for action is clear. The Congressional Budget Office states that these levels of debt will cause incomes to be between 7% and 18% lower in 2035 than they would be otherwise. Another study by economists Reinhardt and Rogoff found that countries with a debt-to-GDP level that is greater than 90%, and I would emphasize, Mr. President, that we are currently at 95%, but that countries with a debt-to-GDP level greater than 90% grow at 1 percentage point less than they would otherwise. In other words, when you're carrying this kind of a debt load, 90% debt to GDP for a sustained period of time, you're bleeding about 1% of economic growth every single year. And as we know from the President's own economic advisors, a 1% reduction, 1% drop in growth translates into about 1 million lost jobs. Now, one of the places that we see that have been really hard hit in our country by the downturn is the state of Ohio. My colleague from Ohio, Senator Portman, is here, and I would be interested perhaps in hearing from him on whether he has seen the evidence of the recovery that's promised by the administration, or does his economy in Ohio still reflect an economy that's held back by excessive regulation, debt, and spending? I'd be interested in the senator from Ohio's perspective on that particular subject.
Well, first of all, I thank my colleague from South Dakota for... Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my colleague from South Dakota for coming to the floor today to talk about the economy and jobs. It's clearly the top issue on the minds of folks in Ohio. And no, the Ohio economy is still hurting. We're not creating the jobs we hope to create. If you look at it nationally, there are now 14 million Americans who are out of work. And more than 1 million want to work but have given up looking for work. So, when you look at what's going on out there, you add the 8.5 million Americans who are getting by with part-time jobs, even though they'd like to work full-time. That's about 23 million Americans suffering from the lack of the full-time job that they want. So this unemployment issue continues to be the number one issue in Ohio and nationally. We've got to address it. And you talked a little today about some of the ways that we need to approach it, including the regulatory overreach and its impact on jobs and small businesses. But let me talk about even a deeper concern in Ohio, and that's the length of time people have been out of work. The average unemployment now is 40 weeks. So that's about 9 months. 9 months. So it's 9 months of stress, 9 months of uncertainty, 9 months of wondering how to make ends meet. This is, I'm told, the worst statistic in terms of length of being unemployed that we've had since the records were kept. So it is not just about these terrible unemployment numbers. It's a fact that when you've been out that long, you lose some of your job skills, you have a gap in your resume, it's harder to get a job. And this is not what was promised, by the way. If you look at what the President and his economists promised when the stimulus was passed, they said that unemployment today would be about 6.7%. Instead, it's over 9%, 9.1%. So it hasn't worked. The President has called it a bump in the road. I unfortunately think it's a lot more than that. The Chairman of the Federal Reserve talked about this yesterday, that he's very concerned now about some of the economic projections. He thinks that we are not in as good a shape as even the projections, which weren't very optimistic, show. 1.8% was the growth in the first quarter. At this point in the last deep recession we had, the growth was 7%. On the spending side, this chart's interesting because it shows federal spending as a percent of the economy, which, as we all know, has gone up significantly, and part of that is because of the stimulus package and then the unemployment rate. And unfortunately, when you look at this, there has not been an increase in spending and a decrease in unemployment. There's been an increase in spending and an increase in unemployment. So I think, you know, this simple notion that you can't spend your way to prosperity, which is a common sense notion that most Americans agree with, has been proven to be true. Unfortunately, the stimulus package did not lead to the kind of progress the President and his team predicted, and you know, we're all paying the price for it. So instead, we need to approach it in a different way. And again, as you mentioned earlier, Senator Thune, part of the answer to this is dealing with the regulations, dealing with our tax system, dealing with these high energy costs, dealing with the high health care costs, which do impact employment, getting the economy back on track through smart pro-growth policies. I know that you also have done a lot of thinking about how do we get out of this mess that we're in instead of the spending, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on what you think about what the debt and the spending is doing to our economy. You mentioned the Rogoff and Reinhardt study showing that our economy would be growing much faster than it is now, but for this big overhang of spending and deficit and debt. But I wonder, Senator Thune, if you had some additional thoughts on that.
Well, I wish I could say to my colleague from Ohio, and I appreciate his observations regarding his state, which is a pivotal state when it comes to whether or not we are going to see the economy recover. Obviously, a state that it feels the impact right away when you have a down economy and job losses and all the negative things that go with that. And so I appreciate his perspective on it, and obviously I wish I could say that this administration and their policies had made the situation better. Unfortunately, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the President and his policies making this situation worse and much worse. For example, as you mentioned, non-defense discretionary spending, which is the part of the spending that the President has to sign into law every year, went up 24% since he took office, which is an astounding amount, particularly when you consider the fact that inflation at that time, over that time period, was about 2%. So government spending was growing at about 10 times the rate of inflation. And what's even more amazing is that this doesn't include the increases in discretionary spending attributable to the stimulus. The stimulus, as we all know, is about $1 trillion of spending that, as the senator from Ohio pointed out, was supposed to have brought the unemployment rate down to 6.7%. Clearly, we're over 9% today. There is no correlation between additional spending and job creation. I think we've clearly demonstrated that. That spending level does not include the spending on the Cash for Clunkers program, which was supposed to have been something that was going to create jobs. It doesn't include unoffset increases in spending on mandatory programs that have been signed into law, like additional unemployment insurance, Medicaid, or trade adjustment assistance. And it doesn't include a variety of different spending increases that the President has fought for, but so far been unsuccessful in passing. So because of this exorbitant spending, we are now at a point where literally 40 cents out of every dollar that the federal government spends is borrowed. Now, while most people would look at this situation and say it's time to do something about it to improve the situation, the President clearly punted. Over the medium and the long term, his proposed budget makes the situation even worse. And in fact, the proposed fiscal year 2012 budget would spend, this was the President's proposal, would spend $46 trillion over the 10-year time period, add $9.47 trillion to the debt, and raise taxes by $1.6 trillion. So their prescription continues to be more spending, more borrowing, and higher taxes. So the question is, I think, is this helping or hurting our economy? And if you look at a recent Bloomberg poll, it found that 65% of Americans think that the debt is a major reason why our unemployment rate is so high. So the answer from the American people is clear. And I guess what I would ask of my colleague from Ohio, and he and I have worked together on some ideas on how we can get the economy going again and create an environment that's conducive to job growth. Clearly getting spending under control here is a huge factor in that, and as he pointed out, there's lots of research out there that demonstrates the connectivity between spending and debt and the economy. I would simply add, too, the rating agencies have all weighed in on this subject. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, they all have come in and said, given a negative assessment to our credit rating, if that led to a downgrade in our credit rating, it would reflect it would be reflected in much higher interest rates, would have another negative impact on our economy. So lots of things about spending and debt clearly have a profound and negative impact on our ability to grow the economy and create jobs. But I'm interested in the senator from Ohio has been a great leader on getting out there in front and talking about things, real solutions that would lead to job creation in this country. And I'd be interested in hearing his thoughts about some of the things that we might be able to do that clearly are not being done today, and frankly, things that I hope would be contrary to policies being put forward by this administration, which are costing us jobs.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are a number of things that can be done, and there's really no reason this can't be done on a bipartisan basis. I just left a hearing in the Governmental Affairs Committee where we talked about regulations, its impact on the economy. And today, the cost of regulations to the economy, hitting particularly small businesses, is about $1.75 trillion. That's more than the IRS collects in income taxes. And there were Democrats and Republicans alike talking about proposals, concerned about the administration's continued regulations. The President said some of the right things, but if you look at the facts, there are more and more regulations, have a bigger and bigger impact. Here in Washington, it's tough to get this under control without changing the law, in my view. So we need to have better process in the agencies to force them to look at cost-benefit analysis, to force them to use the least costly, least burdensome alternative, and so on. So I talked about some legislation we introduced in that area today, as did other, again, Democrats and Republicans alike. So there's some things that we have to do. To your point about the impact of this debt and deficit on the job front, you're absolutely right. And this poll you talked about, where 65% of Americans think that the debt and deficit is a major factor in the high unemployment, they're right. The study you talked about said that if the debt gets past 90% of our economy, it's estimated to cost about 1 million jobs. Here's where we are today. 2010, 93%. We're now at about 100%. We'll be at 105% in 2012, next year. So this is what's happening, is that we are going into exactly that period of where our debt is bigger than our whole economy. And this study, by the way, is based on looking at countries all around the world who have gone through this experience, including countries in Europe that are going through it now, and seeing what the impact is on jobs. And there are solutions. Talked about regulations a second ago. That's certainly one of them. And my hope is that this Senate can vote on sensible regulatory reform, and soon. The story you told earlier about the oil and gas industry, we see this played out all over. Recent proposed regulations from the EPA on emissions from power plants in terms of mercury. All of us want clean air. We know you have to have regulations. The question is, how do you regulate? These particular regulations, very onerous, not coming through Congress, are going to have a big impact on jobs in my state. There's a study out a couple weeks ago saying that it's going to result in thousands of jobs being lost and a few power plants being shut down, and electricity costs increasing 10 to 15% in our state. We can't afford that. We want to keep our costs down. But there's more than that. There's the tax code. We should, again, as a body here and in the House and the administration, reform our tax code to make it simpler, to make it more pro-growth, and it can be done. Economists across the spectrum say, look, this current code is a mess. It doesn't work because you're encouraging businesses to make investments to allocate their resources based on some tax-motivated reason rather than a business reason. And by lowering the rate, getting rid of a lot of these preferences in the code, sort of clearing out the code, you could, as happened in 1986, get more economic growth through the tax code simplification and reform. So that's something that I think the time is here. The President's Fiscal Commission recommended this when they said, how do you look at the next 20 or 30 years and come up with a way to deal with this deficit and debt? They said you've got to have economic growth as part of it. They're absolutely right, and part of what they recommended specifically was tax reform. Making our workforce more competitive. Today we do spend money at the federal level on workforce development, and yet it's not spent very efficiently. So there are some organizations that do it better than others. We should take those best practices and apply them generally. There are now 9 different agencies and departments that are engaged in looking at how to improve our workforce for the 21st century. It is a federal program that when it connects directly with businesses works. When it doesn't work well. There's all kinds of opportunities to reform that program. Again, this should be bipartisan. I hear about it all the time from community colleges, from businesses, what's working, what's not working. Flexibility is the key thing I hear. These federal programs have a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy attached to them. Increasing exports. We need to enforce our trade agreements. We need to enforce the international rules. Enforcement is critical, but we also need to open up markets for our products. Every other country in the world is doing it. They're engaged in opening up markets for their products, for their workers, for their farmers, for their service providers. We've been taking a back seat. This is why we need to be much more aggressive in forcing other countries to open their markets to us. If we don't do that, we don't have access to 95% of the consumers in the world, and we're not going to be able to create the jobs that we need. The President has said that if you just were to pass these 3 trade agreements that are out there, you would create over 250,000 new jobs. Think about that. That's something that we ought to do. It's, again, bipartisan. Somehow we can't seem to get through the process of getting these agreements, these 3 relatively small ones that we've already done, through the process. We need to do that and do that right now because of this economic crisis that we face of unemployment and long-term unemployment. This would really help in combination with a more competitive workforce. On energy, another part of our 7-point plan, and again, this is a jobs plan to get us back on track. We've got to use our own resources. Natural gas, places like Ohio and the Dakotas, South and North Dakota have a lot of oil and natural gas, untapped. We now have new technology to be able to tap it. Let's use it. We may have the greatest resource of natural gas in the world based on some of the geologic finds. We need to use that and use it now, and we can help us get less dependent on foreign oil, a dangerous dependency we have now. And finally, healthcare costs. Talked about this earlier. There's some common sense things we can do right now to get healthcare costs down. Take out some of the costs of healthcare, including stopping the frivolous lawsuits we all pay for through sensible medical malpractice reform. There are some states that do it well. It should now be done on a national level. To get the costs down, allow people also to buy insurance across state lines, force the insurance companies to compete for our business. This is all part of a common sense approach, 7-point plan. Get spending under control, reform the tax code, regulatory relief, have a more competitive workforce, increase jobs through exports while enforcing our trade agreements, power America's economy with our own energy, and have, again, sensible solutions to getting costs of health care down, which will help create jobs. All these things are proposals I know that you, Senator Thune, have been working on, and I appreciate that. I guess I would ask you a question. If you are, as you said, focused on getting at this issue, do you think that we have a problem on the debt and deficit because of the lack of revenue through taxation, or is it through overspending? Do you have any thoughts on that, or any suggestions as to how we deal with, again, these historic deficits and debts that we face?
Well, I appreciate that was a great prescription, by the way. I think the senator from Ohio has hit upon all the issues that are relevant and important if we're going to get the economy recovering and growing and creating jobs again. And so talking about getting trade deals done and energy policy that relies upon American energy production, keeping taxes and regulations low and common sense when it comes to the area of regulation, and getting spending and debt under control. Those are all things I think that are part of a solution that will grow the economy. And I think what I would say to my colleague from Ohio with regard to the issue of taxing and spending, there are a lot of people obviously who believe that somehow we just can get additional revenues, we can raise taxes and solve a lot of these problems. Clearly that would be very counter, I would think, to growing the economy and creating jobs. I think it would be harmful if we were to, if we looked at taxes as a way to deal with the deficit and debt issue. Frankly, I think most Americans believe, and I believe they are right, that this is overwhelmingly a spending issue. If you look at our 40-year average for spending up until 2008, it was about 20.6% of our GDP. And Obama's budget would have us spend about 24.3% of GDP. And so if you look at where we need to focus on, I would say to my colleague from Ohio, it is clearly in the area of getting spending and debt under control and dealing with that issue as opposed to the issue of revenue. So I look forward to working with him on these issues and hope that we can get some policies put in place that will grow the economy and get people in this country back to work.